Um, well, I would like to get going. So if everyone, first of all, I'm Deborah Klotchko, and welcome to Winescapes with Artists. Our guest today is artist Kevin Cooley. So we're going to be raising a glass to all of you, and just a few bits of housekeeping to begin with. Um, we will be turning off your sound and video just so that we can make sure we have a good connection. But at the end, we will turn it all on for everyone. And also, if you use the chat option at the bottom of your screen, you can ask questions as we go, and we're happy to try and answer them. And also at the very end, we'll be answering them. Also, one of the things I wanted to mention is we will be taking a break next Friday. These are a lot of work, as Kevin is about to find out, but they're a lot of fun, but they're a lot of work. So we're going to take a break, and since it is also a holiday weekend, but we will also be slowly releasing our past Winescapes with Artists. We're building up quite a nice library of conversations. So without further ado, cheers to wherever you are, and welcome Kevin. So Kevin, as first of all, thank you for being a part of this.
Thank you.
And our interaction goes back to at least 2013 when you had your an exhibition of 2 video projects at MOPA. And then again, you were part of the Boundless California Invitational in 2016. So we've been able to show your a variety of your work and stay in touch. We've also acquired some of your work for our collection. And so this is a great opportunity for us to learn more about you and learn more about your work. So one of the things that is so fascinating about what you do is the word photographer is not really quite accurate. You are at the intersection of photography, video, and installation. And that is, I think, makes for a really wonderful series of work, body of work, though we are going to be focusing mostly on your photographic projects in this conversation, but you really do much more than that. And you also work in partnership with another artist. Can you talk about that just for a moment?
All right. Well, first of all, yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's great to have done 2 shows with you, to have you collect my work down there. Yes, photography does not fully define my practice, although I do definitely, everything I do is lens-based. So it all references my photographic background. And I do work with another artist, although we're on a bit of a hiatus right now. We've been making different multimedia projects. I met him in 2013 at an artist residency in Omaha, Nebraska, which was a very influential, you'll see later on in my presentation, there's many works have come out of that residency. And we've done, I don't know how many shows, 7 or 8 solo shows in a number of years. Yeah, his name is Philip Andrew Lewis.
Good.
He lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania now, so it's a little hard to
work well, Zoom and everything else, but yes, working collaboratively, I think can be very interesting. I'm not sure that many of the artists that we've been talking with have had that opportunity, but it is something that is an important aspect of the work that you do. I think what I'd like to do is get the slides up, because as a visual artist, we should have visual examples to talk about. Okay. So one of the first slides, so down the street from Buffy the Vampire Slayer from 2001, do you want to talk about the series a little bit, and especially the intriguing title?
Yeah, sure. So this is the first project I did after graduate school. I graduated from the School of Visual Arts in the year 2000. And later that year, I started following around film production, nighttime film production. Started off in New York and ended up doing it in LA towards the end of 2001. And I would just look around for film production, photographing on location, and find things that were near their sets, but weren't necessarily a part of the background or a part of their set itself. So this is, like the title suggests, this is down the street from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is probably shooting 300 or 400 yards to the left. And yet they use these big, bright lights up on cranes to illuminate, almost everything. So it's interesting to sort of find out these little moments, highlight these everyday moments that are were being brought to light literally by the movies being filmed. And
so I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
was going to say the title of the series is Night for Night, which is a film term for shooting at night to make it seem like night, as opposed to day for night or not night for day. There's just different options.
So I do want to say that you're a native Los Angeles. Did I say that right? You're born and live.
Yeah.
Angelino, I think. So are all of the Night for Night images shot in and around the LA area?
No, I started in New York City. They're about half and half.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of ran out of, at the time at least, there wasn't that much film production happening in New York City. So I came to LA and I got in touch with the film office, and they would just give me like a daily report of who was shooting what, where. And,
so I think it's very interesting just how dark the sky is and yet how illuminated the trees are, because this working with night or that transition between day and night is very much a part of many of your projects. So why don't we go to the next slide?
Okay. Yeah, this is from Paris. I was fortunate to do an artist residency in both 2003 and 2004, the summer, in Paris. And the artist residency is in this building directly next to the river, next to the Seine. And at night they have these tourist boats. I'm sure many of you have been on them. These tourist boats called the Bateau Mouche. And they have big bright lights that they shine to illuminate the edges of the river. So the tourists can just see what's going on as they point out different landmarks and neighborhoods. And sitting in my, laying on the bed in my room, I could see the lights shining up on the ceiling as they went by, and the shadows from the trees and whatnot. And I was like, oh, that's my project right there. It's a natural extension of Night for Night. Yet now I'm using these lights from the boats instead of movie lights. So it's another way of, I'm really interested in the idea of mixing ambient light with natural light. Sorry, with introduced light, such as the film lights or now the Bateau Mouche. And other projects, I have other things going on with this similar effect. And
so are you using film at this point?
Yes, this is all film. I've been switching back and forth between film and digital in more recent years, but definitely back in the 2004, I was only shooting film. And this is the view from my room, studio. And I arranged for this person to be put in that other window to look out.
Great. Why don't we move on to the next slide?
Sure. So this is airplanes taking off from JFK Airport. And I did a series called Nachtflug, which is German for night flights. And I started photographing. I lived in Williamsburg, Brooklyn at the time. And I lived under the flight path for LaGuardia. And so, every 2 to 3 minutes, there'd be a plane flying over my apartment. And at first I was pretty annoyed by it. I guess I didn't notice that when I left the apartment, but I eventually got really interested in the idea. I was like, wow, that's really, what would happen to do long? I was really doing a lot of long exposures at the time, and decided to do extremely long exposures of airplanes. So they're leaving the lights you see are the headlights of the airplane. Maybe a little hard to see on the screen, but you can see a little red and a little blue light on either side, and that's the navigation lights that blink.
So when you do night photography, how much pre-visualization, shall we say, is there? I mean, do you know what the colors are going to be?
It's always a bit interesting to see what will happen with long exposures at night. When I first tried the first exposure I did of that was from my window, and I did like a 4-hour exposure, but it got cloudy about halfway through and it totally ruined it. You couldn't see any of the lights. So it had to be a perfectly clear night. So I kind of figured that out. Also, like, long exposure sunsets, you can really make them be vibrant, like this one, like long after sunset. This is probably a couple hours after the sun had gone down. And this is, usually it's about 3 minutes between each flight, or I think maybe it's about a minute. I can't remember anymore. It's been a while, but I always could, you can tell how long these exposures are based on the number of airplanes or lines in the sky.
So these are multiple flights over several hours.
Yeah, well, that one there is 2. There's
Okay.
one that goes kind of to the right and one goes to the left. But many of them have, the one I was describing earlier probably has 100 and some.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them only have 1, some of them have several. It all depends on whether they're taking off or landing as to what the pattern of the light does.
So why don't we go on to the next slide, because I think the connection from that work to this work is really an interesting step.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
I would agree with you there. So this is the first time I started introducing something into the photograph. Before I was just responding to what I would see, and before I'd also been doing a lot of urban landscapes. And now I wanted to bring this sort of a similar idea to the Vandenberg series, but bring it into the landscape. So here I'm working with these Czechoslovakian military flares from like the 1960s. They're like dead stock white illuminating flares that they would use in combat. So I started shooting them into various locations out in the West in the middle of winter. I was getting a little bit confined by the fact that the Nachtflug, I had to shoot near airports. I was limited by where the planes go. And I also needed to be near busy airports to get a lot of them. So I like this idea of taking this further into the landscape, and it's also, I'm sure here I'm starting to work with fire. I mean, flares are essentially fire. And as you'll see in the second half of this presentation, a lot of the work revolves around fire, either fire I've been working with myself or fire that's like wildfires and other naturally occurring fires.
So do you have somebody that's assisting you with this, or is this set on a timer so you can be at the camera while the flare goes off?
Yeah, I would have somebody on a walkie-talkie, and depending on where I wanted the flare to go, I would direct them where to shoot it and when to shoot it over the radio.
So this fascination now with controlling or making the light mark rather than capturing existing light in the sky or outdoor stage sets in a way. So is it because it's part of photography? I mean, light, illumination. What is it that draws you to this idea?
Of introducing the light, or of the light in general?
Of light in general, and then introducing it.
Well, I mean, all photography is essentially about the light, whether it's, you know, a 20th of a second or 3.5 hours. It's about registering light on film or digital. And I was just interested in the, you know, when adding this light, for instance, it's about the human impact on the environment. Like the path that the planes leave is about, you know, how air travel can impact the environment, leaving this lasting mark, you know, the pollution from all the consumption of the fuel that it takes to require to fly these airplanes. This series is a little more about sort of maybe a mysterious communication or lightning. Yeah, looks like there's a question.
Yes, they're asking, why does it suddenly go to the right?
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot, actually. It's actually, it's flying, or it's going straight, but it's coming from pretty close to the camera. So it's a bit of an optical illusion. So it's actually, it's not starting from the middle of this river, it's falling into the river, if that makes sense.
So the flare was up and above to the right when it was set off, and then it's shooting down?
It's kind of coming right from the camera and falling in the middle of the frame.
Got it.
Because of how it's much closer to the frame at the beginning, it kind of, it's just, it's like 2-point perspective in a way, or how you draw that. It kind of makes this, I don't know, weird optical phenomenon.
So let's go to the next slide.
Okay, so this is called controlled burns, and this is when I actually start working with fire directly. So I was, like that last project, it's maybe about some kind of communication between, I don't know, aliens and Earth, or, you know, flares are often used for distress, you know, or to see things, like just to look at that high. I became interested in how the papal conclave, when they were electing a new pope, how they signify whether they had reached their decision or not. So they would use black smoke if they met and hadn't made a decision, or they would use white smoke when they wanted to indicate that they had arrived at a new pope. And so I started working with black and white smoke, and different combinations of putting black, photographing them in a studio. This is what I made in Omaha, Nebraska, at this residency I mentioned before called Venus. And they had this great 10,000 square foot sculpture studio that I got to use and could kind of do whatever I wanted. And they were really encouraging of allowing me to work with toxic smoke in there, as long as I let it air out for several hours afterwards. So I would work from about, I don't know, 1 in the morning until about 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning, and then stay up until dawn, until all the little, so it didn't smell anymore. But I was working exclusively with black and white smoke, black on white, mixing them together, photographing white on black, just different combinations of studio. And what I really like about these is how you really lose a sense of scale.
Right.
And they only exist as 60 by 40 inch prints, which I will say is roughly the size of the actual, what you're seeing in the frame.
So you're playing with our sense of perception as well. And this isn't necessarily a diptych, is it? They're just paired together on the slide?
Yeah, if you look at the titles, the one on the left is number 1 and the one on the right is number 3. I just put the verticals together so we could look at more images quickly.
Okay, why don't we go on to photograms, which I think is next. So this one is also very participatory and very one of a kind as opposed to the other works. So can you talk about this, also about the scale of this work? And was
Right.
this done as part of that residency as well?
Yes. So this is the, well, wasn't able to do, started working with this idea of black and white, which I can process on site in Omaha. But the latter, it turned into these color photograms. But they're more or less exactly the same, other than just how they're processed. So this is looking at the same idea as, or at least for me, as the controlled burns, and was made at the same time, working in that great space. So I would take different sorts of fireworks, and in a dark room, I would lay out several sheets of photographic paper. In this case, these are 16 by 20 sheets. And I would put a layer of mylar on top of it. And the mylar was meant to act as a neutral density filter, because the fireworks are so bright as compared to the sensitivity of the paper. And I would fire these bottle rockets. This is a bottle rocket. It's one of my favorite ones from a kid, called Moon Travelers. They've been around for a long time. And would fire it across the paper, and would leave this explosive texture. Sometimes it would burn through, like in the next one, which is a much larger photogram, it actually would burn through the mylar and leave marks on the paper.
So we need the next slide.
Yeah, so that big black mark is a point where, well, in the center of it, you can see there's like a kind of a dot, and that's an actual burning of the paper.
So Kevin, I find it very intriguing that clearly you know your medium. You have great control over, the equipment, the technology, the, exposures, the printing, and yet most of your subject matter is very, in a sense, out of your control, or is responsive in ways that you may not know at first till you see the finished piece. So, what is that? What draws you to that?
I've never been asked that before. That's an interesting question. Yeah, definitely as a photographer, I like to be in control, and I like to capture as much things as possible in the photographs. I don't do a lot of work afterwards, like Photoshop work afterwards. There were several failed versions of these too. It wasn't like every single one of them was what I wanted. So maybe, the control part was in selecting which ones I kept and which ones I discarded.
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, your work, one of the things that appealed, well, first of all, someone would like to know the size. So so keep that in mind. The other, what really appeals to me about your work is it's very much about the marriage of art and science, which is what photography fundamentally is.
Sure.
And so, you are working with fire, a fundamental element, light, which is basic to the medium. And it is, some of these are experiments, almost in a scientific way,
Right.
that are really quite beautiful. So that's why they speak to me, I think, so on so many levels.
Yeah, one thing I really like about these is you also can't tell like what they are in terms of scale. Again, like this could be like some kind of meteorite going across an inverse image of the galaxy,
Yeah.
Or it could be something happening at a microscopic level.
But what size is it?
Okay, so this one is 48, I think, by 108 or 109 inches. And it's just one big sheet of color paper that I processed. And the last one it's 3 16 by 20 separate images.
And I found it very interesting. We talked about the processing when we had an earlier conversation.
Yeah.
And so these went to a lab that could do color processing, but you want to talk about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, it was very hard to convince somebody to let me put my my paper, which was contaminated with firework residue, into a processor, which is a very controlled chemical situation. And I found a lab that finally agreed to let me do it when they were going to change over their chemistry anyway. So so I had to make these and then hold on to them, keeping track of which ones would go together and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a bit of a puzzle putting some of them back together, but yeah, it was very gracious that they allowed me to do it at all.
Well, really exquisite. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Okay. So this is part of Vandenberg Series, right? From 2013. So you were very busy that year.
Yeah, 2013 was a very pivotal year for me. I was, the artist residency, you're really working with other artists, and it's very motivating each day you wake up and it's just like you're running around for the whole day trying to make work. And I was working on several different projects at the same time. And yeah, I think I got about as much work done in that 3-month period as I probably have like in the last year and a half. So when I got back to California, and I always had been interested in the rocket launches out of Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is along the Central Coast. Again, this is an idea of rockets are essentially a human control over fire, but in this case, we're using it to launch into space. And so this is a payload for the National Reconnaissance Office, which means it's a classified payload, which basically means it's a spy satellite. So the rocket takes off, and then its exhaust plume slowly turns into this benign cumulus cloud, which I like how it's like this idea that the spy satellite is like hiding in plain sight, it just becomes this natural looking thing. So I like the conversation between, human control over fire and nature that's happening here.
And what is the scale of this work?
Okay, so these are, gosh, what are the sizes of each one? I think they are like 14 by 18, each one. Something like that, yeah.
And they're meant to be seen together.
Yes, they're meant to be seen together. Chantel Paul, she actually curated a show, and she asked me if she could put these vertically. I'd always thought about them being horizontal.
Mm-hmm. And
she mounted them on this column at the UCSD space in the Gaslight District. And it looked really interesting to see them that way. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but in a way it kind of made sense too, the rocket going up.
Good. Let's move on to the next slide.
Okay.
Which is part of the work that we included in Boundless. And this is 1,000 miles per hour series. So can you talk about this series?
Sure. So this idea originated as a video, a 2-channel video that I had made. And essentially 1,000 miles an hour is the speed at which the Earth rotates. And I used, we think about the sun and the moon, we think about them, traveling around us, like the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. But really we know that it's us rotating, right? So 1,000 miles an hour. So I used this astronomical tracking system, which is basically a mount for a telescope that will allow you to point at some object in the sky, and it'll keep it in the center of the frame. So instead of mounting a telescope to the telescope, so like a telescope to the mount, I mounted my camera, in this case a 4x5 camera, but also a video camera. And what it would do is it would keep the sun, centered, yet the exposure would, it's maybe, Arturo, you can zoom in on these two, where you can kind of see like the landscape is very blurry, yet the one on the left there is the sun, and the one on the right is the moon. It's actually, that one is the partial eclipse, as you can see, but it's the landscape there is very blurry. So these are about 20-minute exposures, which would give you enough of the sense of the Earth rotating. But and then
do we have an installation slide next?
Yes, we do. So you can see different ones. So I'm sure some of you are wondering, like, why are they mounted at these strange angles? So part of the setting up the telescope system is you have to tell the system where you are in terms of your longitude and latitude. So it can then calculate where objects are in the sky. And part of that is you have to physically move the mount itself in terms of its angle. And I really like this idea of connecting it, to the Earth. So I decided to make these, and the camera would be on a crazy angle too. So I like the idea of keeping it the way it looked as you mount it to the telescope, as a way of indicating where on the Earth you are. So in the case of the last ones, they were shot at Mount Wilson, which is where there is one of the world's greatest observatories. It's pretty outdated now, but it was the center of the astronomical universe at the turn of the century. So I like the idea of having this dialogue with that history. But Los Angeles is at 34 degrees north, so they're on a 34-degree angle. The ones on the right here are from Canada, from Banff National Park, and they're on, I forget exactly, I think it's 59 or 60. And then I traveled to the Caribbean and did some images there, which are 14 degrees. So there was sort of a varied locations and various angles.
Do you do any color correction or manipulation?
No, not really. I mean, I guess people call it like straight Photoshop, but no, these are pretty. I mean, I do use computers to make the images, but yeah, these are pretty straight.
Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, so this is a behind-the-scenes image of me in an attempt to make this at. It didn't work, but at Monument Valley, I made one. So it's this big tripod, and it has this crazy, you can't really see it, but right where the sun is, there's like a 30-pound piece of mechanical equipment and like a barbell with like a weight on it to counterbalance it. And it runs off this giant battery. So it's a bit of a commitment to haul this thing around. I'm actually selling the whole thing right now on Craigslist if you're interested. Along with the telescope, because I don't have any room for it, but it's like 4 cases of gear.
Okay, well, you did your pitch, so we'll see what you.
My pitch.
We'll send any positive responses to you directly. Why don't we go to the next slide?
So after the 2016 election, I wanted to revisit the idea of the controlled burns. But this time I was working with colored smoke instead of black and white. And I wanted to take the work outside rather than leaving the studio behind and bringing it into the landscape. but I mostly pointed it at the sky, so you wouldn't really get a sense of, when you put in the landscape, it changes the scale, so you suddenly, these smoke columns start to seem sort of small. So I tried to keep them just interacting with the clouds and the skies. I like that dialogue between the color of the smoke and the clouds in the background, the nature, the different types of clouds.
So are you shooting fairly rapidly on these images,
Yeah,
or?
well, they're actually, they're lit with a strobe. I have strobe lights on them on either side. So I'm only able to do, every time I light off a little tiny smoke creation, little canister, I get about 1 or 2 shots maybe. So yeah, there are plenty of rejects for this project, but
So not to take away the mystery of these, are you mixing whatever it is that you then make into smoke? Or
yeah,
do
so
you
I
work
would,
with a pyrotechnic kind of a person?
yes, I work with a pyrotechnist, and he has been advising me on the smoke, and you'll see later I've been doing these small explosions. He's
Are
been,
you on anybody's watch list? I mean, you're buying Czech
well,
flares and making explosions.
yeah, interesting that you asked that. So I started working with this guy. He lives in Minnesota, and he's been invited. I went to finally go visit him. I mean, I spent several hours on the phone with him, but his world is fascinating. And so I've been doing a documentary collaboration with him, and I published a series of images of him doing things on his farm, which is just part of his daily routine. He's like lighting things on fire and blowing things up, and
Just because he wants to, or he's practicing his craft, or?
well, it's a long story, but he's a true pyromaniac. He calls himself a pyrotechnist, but you know he's really just into fire. And I published a bunch of this work in a popular science magazine.
Mhm.
And about 6 months later, the ATF came, and he's now in jail.
Is he still taking your calls?
He actually called me this morning. You know, he doesn't blame me. You know,
Mhm.
it's I didn't. I mean, I feel somewhat responsible. This is kind of taking this conversation to the left here, but um,
That's okay.
um, yeah. So I've been doing a whole. I have a book that is ready to be published, and we're working with Cure Press, the German company. So hopefully we'll get that together sometime in the next year or two. So it's sort of a collaboration between showing some of my works that I've been making with his under his guidance, and then just sort of a more traditional documentary look at his fascinating way of living.
Why don't we go on to the next slide?
Sure.
So here we deal with the real fire.
Yeah, so in the middle of working on all these fire things, I moved to the foothills north of Los Angeles, and about a week later, this wildfire came to me. It came ended up coming about 100 yards away from my new home, and so I photographed the fire. I photographed its aftermath. But this is a shot of it sort of coming over the hill. I live at the bottom of the hill. I lived at the bottom of the hill there, and I shot this on a 4x5, and sort of in my haste, I loaded a slide, a holder that had been damaged. So those are like light leaks coming in there. But I really liked how that sort of was a reference to the earlier photograms, sort of that process nature of photography.
Let's go on to next.
Yeah, so these are what I've been working on most recently in terms of fire. It's on a bit of a hiatus now because my pyrotechnist is unavailable, but these are called exploded views, and that's like a term for an image of the mechanical workings of like a piece of machinery. You see all the parts fit together, and so I'm using that idea to describe these explosions. And again, I like how you don't really have a sense of scale, whether you're looking at, a galaxy or some kind of jellyfish floating in the water.
And so the La Tuna fire was massive, a lot of destruction, death, devastation.
Right.
You're now back in control. And so that must have been quite something to process. And now you're going back to this work. So are we, at what scale are we at with these?
In terms of the prints? Or,
yeah.
Yeah, these are, I think they're back to largest is like 51 inches by 40 inches wide. And I also, these ones I decided to make in more than one size. So I also make them like a 25 and a half by 20.
And these are they all just the black background?
No, I do have some where I've been working in the landscape again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that these explosions are very bright and the landscape gets to be very dark because of that. Like these are actually photographed without even a backlight. There's no black seamless background behind this. This is just shot. I could even shoot these during the day. It's so bright. I'm shooting at like the slowest ISO and the highest shutter speed and putting neutral density filters on my camera. Yeah, so there's a lot of technical stuff going on here, and then the chemistry is all pretty interesting too in terms of just how a slight, like an extra half a gram of titanium, like totally changes like the effect. So working with magnesium and
so referencing the La Tuna fire again, how do you contain any actual environmental damage?
For these?
Yeah.
Yeah, these are very small. They're like the one on the left, the diameter of the sparks going out from one side to the other is maybe a foot and a half, maybe. And the other one is probably even smaller. Maybe I should have included a behind the scenes of this. I have been shooting.
So you said for this series you decided to do a smaller version. What led you to that choice?
Yeah, that's a good question. I felt like the scale was not as important because it's kind of hard to tell how big these are anyway. I felt like the controlled burns, I wanted to make them large enough where you could really get into all the nooks and crannies of the smoke.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't feel like that was quite as happening quite as much in these images. So it was more just about seeing them, I guess, at face value, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And why don't we, so I had asked you so you said these were on hiatus. And we're living in a lockdown situation, very different times. And what are you working on now?
So, I was thinking about that image from Paris with the woman looking out the window, and that seemed to resonate a lot differently now with COVID. And
can we go to the next slide?
I wanted to start thinking about, people in their houses. So I've been doing a series. I'm photographing now like most nights, maybe 4 or 5 times a week. Just people in their homes, isolated. And I'm outside, they're inside, so they're socially distanced. Portraits. I think of them as portraits. I'm not sure if I think about them as art, but it's certainly. Yeah, Deborah was joking with me the other day. She's like, "It's okay, it's artist therapy," which is fine for now. But I've I've been thinking a lot about how, as we're spending so much more time at home, like just how our relationship to architecture or to the idea of home is evolving as well. So I've been photographing, like this is a Cappy house, the architect Ray Cappy from the I think it's the early 50s, this house. But I've been photographing different types of architecture from famous architects to, just stucco framed houses.
So it's as much about the architecture as it is about it's a portrait of the house and the people inside, is what it seems. And what I like is this connection back to your earlier work.
Yeah.
That is, it makes a really nice thread to all that you're doing. But yeah.
Yeah, my work is sort of weaves in and out of different. I mean, you could look at it you can see connection between a lot of the things. Sometimes it's more obvious than others, but this is definitely like a throwback to something from 16 years ago.
But with new eyes and new experiences.
Yeah.
So it's, I'm not even going to ask you size on this because as I understand it, the work is so new, it's you're really in the shooting mode right now.
Yeah, like this, I just shot this one last week. So I don't even know if I would even make prints. I don't know. This is so new, I'm not really sure.
You're not done yet. So, one of what I want to share is that your work is available. Your gallery is Paul Kopeikin in Los Angeles, and it's. Did you study chemistry? Was that one of your areas in school, or it's just interesting to see how much, in a sense, how much science, how much chemistry, how much optics you bring into to your work.
I wanted to study chemistry at school, but I was terrible at it. I actually studied international politics. Yes, I definitely always had an interest in science, and especially in flight and space flight, things like that.
Well, I appreciate you taking us on this journey of your work. We're certainly open to any questions that people might have. And so is the book that you had mentioned, is that designed and waiting to be printed, or is it a little bit earlier in the process?
Well, I think with the it was designed and ready to go. I think with the development of him being now in jail, I think I want to somehow find a way to include that. So I feel like it's gonna evolve a little bit more. He's been sending me letters and things, and I feel like there's a lot of now material I could photograph myself, include in some way. It's basically just waiting to be funded. So that's the major hurdle now. So.
Well, it sounds fascinating, and do you have anything else you want to share with us at this moment? I appreciate seeing the range of your work. And again, we really focused on the photography, not on the video. The video that we did have at the museum in 2013 came out of your Arctic Circle residency, didn't it?
Well, there were two things. There was
Right,
a
in LA.
2-channel video that was of an iceberg being towed behind a boat by a lasso. The idea was like you would tow it all the way to the equator and it would melt away, kind of idea. And then the other video was a video that I shot all in Los Angeles, where you lay down on the floor and there's a screen hanging from the ceiling, and you look up to this sort of fantastical narrative that takes you through the mixture of urban and natural overlap of different iconic Los Angeles elements that become a singular continuous tracking shot. So the idea is that you start kind of downtown Los Angeles and work your way out to the ocean. But in the meantime, you see birds, airplanes, freeway overpasses, parks and bees. But it all is seamlessly put together. I like to think of it as these individual truths, but put together in a supernatural sort of way.
Great. Arturo, why don't we put everybody on the screen and open up their video, and we can see if people have any questions, or we can put them on the spot because we've had our artist on the spot. And I want to thank everybody for today's visit with us. And you're all muted and you're all still, there we go.
Good.
It's good to see everybody. Okay.
Yeah, I can. Oh, I had one question.
Yes, who's speaking?
Bob.
Yes,
I
Bob.
read my video to.
That's fine.
I was interested in that cove, the last photograph you showed us. How did you decide? Did you pose the woman and the man, and how did you decide how you wanted to do that? You used the different rooms. The woman's more in focus because she's closer, I guess. But how did you decide how to set it up?
Well, they are posed, clearly. I mostly ask them like where they spend during this period, like how are they existing in their homes? And the guy was immediately like, I'm sitting at this table like all day long, all night long, just working on his laptop. This is what he does. So I left him there, and then with that house, also part of it's about my response to the architecture, and that house really seemed to be, as open as it was, a sort of mid-century style. There were definitely moments of isolation, so I wanted to keep her, apart from him, and that was what I thought was the best angle to shoot, to capture this idea. Because even though we're isolated from the world, I feel like the more time you spend with your immediate family, like even the more isolated you can become from them, because of the the overload of time that we're spending together.
All right, thank you.
How many houses have you shot in this project so far?
I think last night, I did my 17th one. And I was thinking of just, continuing to shoot until, this stay-at-home order is lifted, or I don't know, maybe just from now on I'll just shoot this. I don't know. So I keep on asking everyone if they have other, because it's all about the windows, really. It's hard to shoot people who have certain types of windows or small windows. So I just been asking people if they have acquaintances or friends that would be interested in
Which photographers do you look to? I mean, I'm suspecting that Trevor Paglen is an artist that is of interest to you, but who else has influenced your work?
Well, the
or do you
earlier
look
work is
to and
the earlier work is definitely influenced by like the the German photographers, for sure. What do I look at now? I don't. I probably don't look at enough photography now. I've been reading this video book that just came out about the history of video, and that's been pretty fascinating to think about, the work I've made in the context of video history. So I've been working a lot with these video uh, installations. So that's been interesting to think about.
okay. All right, folks. I'm going to say thank you to our artist and try to raise my glass without knocking my computer. So thank you all, Kevin Cooley, and thank all of the people that joined us today for Winescapes with Artists. Kevin, your work is brilliant. I enjoy it. I'm endlessly fascinated by the various projects. So keep up the good work. And I'm so glad that we've been able to exhibit you at MOPA and that we have some of your work in the collection. So thank you. And thank you for being a part of MOPA to everyone.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you again.